about genetics. Genetics is the study of heredity. And heredity was originally started by a guy named Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian monk that carried out a lot of important studies in regards to heredity. He discovered that characteristics that are inherited are called traits. He was the first person to succeed in predicting how those traits are then transferred from one generation to the next. A complete explanation, though, requires a careful study of genetics, which is what we are going to do today. Mendel started his genetics study with pea plants. Now, pea plants produce sexually, which means that they produce both male and female sex cells. And again, if you remember, we call these sex cells gametes. But now, when you have a male gamete and a female gamete that combine, they call this process fertilization. Or in plants, it's similar to the phrase pollination. That fertilized cell then is called a zygote. That zygote then develops into a seed in plants or into an embryo in animals. And what he did first is since he wanted to test different characteristics or different traits, he cross-pollinated a tall pea plant with a short pea plant. He referred to the offspring then of this cross as hybrids. A hybrid is the offspring of parents that have different forms of the trait. So in this case, we had a tall plant, a short plant. When they were cross-pollinated, they developed a hybrid offspring. Now, in the first generation of plants that were produced, he noticed that when he had 6-foot-tall pea plant crossed with a 2-foot-tall pea plant, all the offspring, or what we call the F1 offspring, grew to be as tall as the taller parent. They were 6 feet tall. So in his first generation, it was basically as if the shorter parent had never existed. Now, Mendel then allowed all the tall plants in his first offspring plants to self-pollinate. He planted more than 1,000 seeds. And what he found out then in the second generation is that 3/4 of those plants were as tall as the tall plants in the first generation. They were 6 feet tall. But 1/4 of those plants were short. They were only 2 feet tall, just like the parent offspring 2 generations ago. So he thought this was kind of odd. That trait of shortness seemed to skip a generation and then all of a sudden reappear in the second generation. So he concluded that each organism has 2 factors that control each of its traits. We know that these factors are genes and that they're located on the chromosomes. Genes exist in alternate forms, and we call these different gene forms alleles. Make sure you know that word, alleles. Mendel's pea plants had 2 alleles of the gene that determined its height. This means then that a plant could have 2 alleles for tallness, it could have 2 alleles for shortness, or it could have 1 of each, 1 allele for tallness and 1 allele for shortness. And this would explain why that second generation didn't have any tall plants, but the third generation did. An organism's 2 alleles are located on different copies of a chromosome, one that's inherited from the female parent and one that's inherited from the male parent. Now, in that first generation, the trait for tallness was shown in every single plant. Mendel called that observed trait dominant. He called the other trait, the trait for shortness, recessive. So in the case of that first generation where all the plants were tall, the allele for tall plants was dominant to the allele for short plants. We call this the law of segregation, and basically what the law of segregation states is that every individual has 2 alleles of each gene, and when gametes are produced, each gamete receives one of these alleles. Kind of like what you see in this diagram here. Now, if those 2 alleles differ, then one, the dominant allele, is fully expressed in the organism's appearance. The other allele, what we would call the recessive allele, has no noticeable effect. In fact, we won't even know that it has that recessive allele unless it's passed on to one of its offsprings. Because those alleles for each trait separate during the process of gamete formation, we call this the law of segregation. Mendel suggested that the alleles for tallness and shortness in that first generation of plants had segregated from each other during the formation of those gametes, or those sex cells. So that meant that in that first offspring, when each plant flowers and produces gametes, the two alleles segregate from each other, so that each gamete carries only a single copy of the gene. Therefore, then, each plant produces two types of gametes, those with the allele for tallness and those with the allele for shortness. Now, in that law of segregation, we're talking about just one particular trait, one particular character, in which case they separate. But what happens when you're involving two traits, like you see in this diagram here? The two pairs of alleles will segregate independently of each other. And this is called Mendel's law of independent assortment. This means that if I have a big R, little r, and a big Y, little y, the alleles big R and little r will separate from each other, as well as the alleles for big Y and little y. Another way of looking at this is, again, when we're talking about two traits, that the alleles, let's say for the height of the plant, is segregated independently of the alleles for, let's say, the color of the plant. This is the law of independent assortment. Genes that segregate independently do not influence each other's inheritance. Now, this independent assortment actually helps account for many of the genetic variations that are observed in plants, animals, and other organisms. Make sure you have in your notes what an allele is, what the law of segregation is, and what the law of independent assortment is. Also, make sure you know the difference between a dominant allele and a recessive allele. Bring that with you to class, and I'll see you.